Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary ideas and more to help you become a literary expert. So if this sounds like what you need, then make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you never miss out on my future weekly videos. Now in this video, we are taking a closer look at the three minor characters in Henrik Ibsen's play A Doll's House, which are Mrs. Linde, who is also referred to as Kristine by Nora throughout the play, Nils Krogstad, and also Dr. Rank. Mrs. Linde, otherwise known as Kristine by Nora, is Nora's school friend and also a childless widow whom we later discover had a romantic relationship with Krogstad once upon a time. Krogstad is a junior employee at the bank that Torvald Helmer, Nora's husband, works, and he's also a single father who is in dire financial straits. In the play, Krogstad is significant because he knows about the forgery that Nora had committed to acquire the loan for her husband's treatment, which is a secret that he exploits as blackmail for Nora to advocate for his job in front of Torvald on his behalf. And finally, Dr. Rank is a family friend of the Helmers with terminal tuberculosis, and by the end of his life, it's revealed that he has harbored long-standing unrequited feelings for Nora. Now, as with the case of minor characters in general, they often function as a foil or a point of contrast to the main characters, highlighting the protagonist's virtues or flaws, freedoms or constraints. They could also serve as catalysts for the narrative, as their actions and decisions affect what happens to the protagonists, which in the case of A Doll's House, most primarily hinges on whether Krogstad spills the beans to Torvald about Nora's illegal bond, and ultimately how that impacts the Helmer's marriage and the household. So anyway, it's pretty straightforward what we're going to do and what we're going to analyze in this rest of this video. So let's get straight into it. So on the most basic level, Mrs. Linde is Nora's foil. Whereas Nora is a bit naive and romantic, Mrs. Linde is practical and hard-headed. Nora is married with 3 children, while Mrs. Linde is widowed and childless, which also makes it a tad bit ironic that she, and not Nora, who's the actual married woman in the play, is referred to by her marital honorific, Mrs. We see this contrast between Nora and Mrs. Linde quite clearly at the start of Act 1, when Nora expresses her pity towards Kristine for her dreadfully sad life as a woman alone without husband or child, while Kristine comments on Nora's sheltered naivete as someone who has not worked for a paycheck or has not really had to reckon with the trials and tribulations in life. This exchange marks a moment of dramatic irony, because at the end of the play, Nora will opt for a new life where she becomes, in fact, quite alone, shedding her poster-bourgeois happy wife identity and leaving behind her husband or children, not at all feeling dreadfully sad, but instead liberated, perhaps achieving what she keeps saying as the most wonderful thing, which is individual freedom. What's interesting as well is that you'll notice there is a gradual reversal of fate between Nora and Mrs. Linde as the play progresses, with Mrs. Linde moving from singlehood as a widow to an implied second marriage, or at least a relationship with Krogstad, her former lover, towards the end of the play, and then Nora exiting her supposedly perfect marriage for a new life as a single emancipated woman. This is an example of structural irony, and what this mirroring of fates between Nora and Mrs. Linde suggests is that Ibsen is neither condemning domesticity nor championing feminism as far as Nora's final choice to leave her marriage goes, but simply showing us that staying in or leaving a marriage is really just that, a choice. And just as Nora decides to leave her marriage after 8 years of partnership with Torvald, so Mrs. Linde chooses to enter into a new marriage with Krogstad after years of being alone. And just as Nora is fed up with living her life for others at the expense of her own, so Mrs. Linde has had enough of living for her own means and wants to now embrace a life where she can, in her own words, finally have someone to work for and live for, a home to bring comfort into. So this transformation gives Ibsen's characterization of the woman a degree of human depth. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. On the one hand, he obviously challenges the traditional and what would have been prevalent in 19th century Norwegian society notion that the right way for women to live is to be a wife and mother for life. But equally, he also suggests that embracing a new marriage after widowhood is also a viable, possible, and perfectly respectable option, as in the case of Mrs. Linde. So what the inverted trajectories of Nora and Mrs. Linde shows then is that a woman is a complex, fluid being who changes and evolves over time, and not at all the static moral archetype. A woman is someone whose needs and desires can evolve, and that whether she chooses to be a partner to a man or a member in a household is not indicative of her worth in society or as a person, but simply it is an individual decision that she makes based on what she wants at a given point in her life. Just because Nora no longer wants to be Mrs. Helmer and the mother of 3 lovely children doesn't make her a bad or immoral woman. And likewise, that Mrs. Linde no longer wants to be a single working woman, but would rather be a wife and stepmother, doesn't make her any less independent or self-sufficient as a person. Now, among all the characters in the play, Krogstad is perhaps the most complex one, as someone whom the audience probably can't decide whether to despise or sympathise with. On the one hand, his brazen blackmailing of Nora by threatening to expose the truth about her forgery doesn't make him the most likeable character. Yet Krogstad inspires pathos because we know that he is harshly, arguably also unfairly, condemned by society to be a moral degenerate simply because of a past misdeed, which is also a forgery, leaving him financially destitute. In this sense, then, Krogstad elicits reflection on the correlation between law and justice, which people may often take for granted as truth, but is of course much murkier, if not sometimes contradictory, in reality. And when we consider what it is that Krogstad really wants, which is just to keep his job and to be treated with a bit more humanity and kindness, as Mrs. Linde eventually does show him, we're likely to agree that he doesn't really deserve the sort of demonization by characters like Torvald and Rank. It's also not that hard to empathise with Krogstad's indignation and desire for vindication, given what he sees of Nora, as someone who has also committed the same crime and yet is free from social condemnation, unlike his own unfortunate case. So if we were to see the play as a critique of stuffy bourgeois moralism, then Krogstad highlights the sanctimonious, judgmental nature of society, especially as demonstrated by characters like Torvald and Dr. Rank, who refer to Krogstad respectively as a guilty man who has to lie and play the hypocrite with everyone, and a man who suffers from a diseased moral character. But Krogstad is significant on a dramaturgical level because Torvald and Rank's clear ignorance of Nora and Krogstad's affiliation is what creates the key dramatic irony in the play, and reinforces how little we often know about those who are supposedly close and dear to us. And this sort of ignorance from Torvald in particular is indicative of what Nora eventually points out as a lack of understanding, and perhaps more hurtfully, a lack of desire to understand her, which will only snowball into deep discontent and ultimately a complete disintegration of their marriage. Krogstad is also interesting because he challenges the conventional assumption that hierarchy, whether it be the socioeconomic or professional sort, necessarily confers power and influence, as reflected in his exchange with Nora earlier on in Act 1, when he asks her to exercise her influence with Torvald and to help him regain his position at the bank. Nora's disdainful remarks of Krogstad as my husband's subordinate and her gleeful musing on how Torvald has so much power over so many people soon ring ironic when Krogstad reminds her of his damning knowledge about the forgery that she has committed and the consequences of Torvald's discovering this, as he tells her that I have means to compel you, and his tit-for-tat threat that if I lose my position the second time, you shall lose yours with me. Of course, ultimately the tables are turned when Krogstad relents his decision to expose Nora and returns her bond, but she is the one who willingly gives up her position in the Helmer household, breaking off her bondage, as it were, from Krogstad and reclaiming the power that Krogstad has held over her for most of the play, because by leaving the marriage, she's basically saying, I don't give a about what my husband thinks anymore. Now, unlike Krogstad, Dr. Rank is a well-respected member of society, and he seems to live by all the moral virtues that the 19th century Norwegian bourgeoisie would find agreeable. Yet his life is marked by deep tragedy, being both a lonely single man who harbours unrequited feelings for someone else's wife, and a chronic patient of spinal tuberculosis, which he had inherited from his father. Rank tries his best to live morally, but his eventual confession to Nora about his feelings for her, motivated largely by the thought of his impending death, suggests that he is also more human than saint, and also that even the most morally upright person can be vulnerable to darker desires, such as coveting someone else's wife. It's just a matter of whether or not they choose to act on it, of course. So Rank's confession, though, is also arguably selfish, because while he may feel relieved from having offloaded his secret love for Nora before dying, he leaves Nora with the conflicted, awkward knowledge of a close family friend having developed more than cordial feelings for her. It's a tragic point of irony that while he points out all his patients suffer from some sort of moral disease, his ultimate assessment is that I am the most wretched of all my patients, being afflicted with what he calls a bankrupt internal economy. While it's likely that this refers to his terminal tuberculosis, it perhaps also suggests that for all the moral judgments he has passed on people like Krogstad, he is haunted by his own temptations towards immoral thoughts, such as perhaps having feelings for Nora. But it's worth considering if perhaps Rank's rigid binary moralism isn't actually a factor that catalyzes his death, and that Ibsen might be suggesting that holding oneself to such high standards of moralistic dogma isn't only unrealistic, but also quite unhealthy. There's a moment when Rank, as he reveals his impending death to Nora, comments on the sheer ugliness of his condition, and that Torvald's refined nature gives him an unconquerable disgust at everything that is ugly, which is why he can't bear to be in the household towards his death. This is ironic because, unbeknownst to Rank, the Nora that's standing in front of him would of course be deemed morally ugly and thus wholly unacceptable to Torvald, and yet she has been living in the same space as her husband for 8 years. But anyway, in terms of Dr. Rank, what it reveals is that he doesn't conceive of himself in compassionate human terms. And the way he sees it, people, including himself, must either be moral or sinful, virtuous or ugly, healthy or else dead. Living with contradictory desires or the acknowledgement of one's multidimensionality doesn't seem like an option for Rank. And this sort of moral absolutism is reflected in Rank's diction as well. For instance, when he comments on his poor innocent spine as paying the penalty of another man's sin, and how in every single family, in one way or another, some such inexorable retribution is being exacted. Perhaps Rank being a doctor is Ibsen's way of poking fun at this line of trade, with the classic irony of doctors falling ill when their entire livelihood depends on their ability to cure. But the fact of the matter is that even doctors are human, and thus are liable to not only physical ailments, but also moral lapses. And the denial of this is unnecessary, unrealistic, and harmful, as suggested by Dr. Rank's eventual death. But if there's any vindication of his profession, then perhaps one could read Rank's death as the ultimate cure for the Helmer's dysfunctional, dishonest marriage. Because towards the end of the play, right before Torvald reads Krogstad's fateful letters, his lament that Rank, with his sufferings and his loneliness, was like a cloudy background to our sunlit happiness, it pushes the dramatic irony of the moment to its climax, because very soon Nora will expose that the so-called sunlit happiness is a sham, and that Rank's death has in fact lifted the cloudy fog of blissful pretense that has shrouded the Helmer's marriage. And instead of being a dark, cloudy backdrop, his death serves as a kind of disinfectant akin to sunlight, shining down on Nora and Torvald's relationship and finally revealing the grim, loveless reality at its core. And there you have it, guys. That's my analysis of Mrs. Linde, Krogstad, and Dr. Rank, who are three minor but nonetheless very important characters in Ibsen's play A Doll's House. So I hope this has given you some new, refreshing insights into the play and has also inspired your own ideas about Ibsen's characterization. Now for your next video, I recommend that you watch my analysis on the 3 key symbols in A Doll's House, which is going to help deepen your understanding of the play's broader themes and ideas. As always, Hit that thumbs up button below if you found this video helpful in any way so that YouTube can spread it to other passionate lit learners like yourself all around the world and that you can encourage me to keep making these useful videos for you. Please also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already and hit that bell notification below so you never miss out on my future weekly videos. Finally, you can also consider joining my membership program for exclusive video requests and essay review perks. You can click the join button below to find out more. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!